Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We will be getting started right now. Jack, take it away.
Good. Thank you, Greta, and thank you, David. This day before Armistice Day, my name is Jack Gilroy, and I'm a member of Veterans for Peace of Broome County, New York, and Peace Action of Broome County, New York. And it's our pleasure, really, to offer David Swanson, director of World Beyond War and author of numerous books on war, including War is a Lie and his most recent book, Leaving World War II Behind, which I've read, and it's really excellent. It's something that students in high school, students in universities and colleges really should have this book of David Swanson's. He has so much to say in the book that he won't be able to cover it during this hour or so that he's on here. So please keep that in mind. Our two peace-focused groups in the southern tier of New York are Peace Action and Veterans for Peace. We've worked side by side for years, and now in the past few months, we've come together more so, sharing our meetings and actions as one. We believe more peace and justice groups need to do the same, to come in solidarity. Hopefully that's going to happen. Peace Action is considered to be the largest peace organization in the United States, and it dates back about 60 years to Sane Freeze. Its goal is to achieve a world free of nuclear weapons in the future, and stopping the development as well in the testing and the spread and the use of weapons today. So Peace Action promotes resolution of international conflicts through cooperation and diplomacy, and to advance national spending priorities that meet the nation's real security and domestic needs. And Veterans for Peace. Veterans for Peace is perhaps the most consistently active nonviolent peace organization in the United States. Look around. If you see the Veterans for Peace flag flying on an Indian reservation for justice reasons, for Black Lives Matter, at drone bases, the killer drone bases around the country, you'll see the Veterans for Peace flag. So you'll see it flying proudly for sure. Veterans for Peace now has chapters around the world. We're in Korea, we're in Japan, we're in Okinawa, we're in the United Kingdom and Ireland, and soon, hopefully, to be in Spain. And we should say, too, that Veterans for Peace is an educational, like Peace Action, educational and humanitarian nonprofit organization dedicated to the abolishment of war. Our collective experiences tell us wars are easy to start and hard to stop, and that those hurt are often the innocent, the civilians. David will speak for about 20 minutes, then he'll open up the discussion. And each individual can make a comment or they can ask a question. Hopefully questions would be good, and he's used to hardball questions, so don't hold anything back, okay? And when you do this, of course, there's the little button, the raise your hand button. If you click that, then you'll be able to speak. And we're, of course, limiting the amount of time that people would speak, but say what you have to say. Our Peace Action team of Binghamton, New York, and Veterans for Peace welcome, therefore, David Swanson, director of World Beyond War, and with special thanks to the organizational person, the director of World Beyond War's organization, and that is Greta Zero. Thanks to both of you, and thanks for all of you for stopping by today, the day before Armistice Day, formerly called Veterans Day, right? Okay, thanks, David.
Yeah, the once and future Armistice Day, at the moment called Veterans Day by a lot of misguided people. Thank you to Jack Gilroy. Thank you to Greta Zaro, who's helping us out here. Yes, lots of applause for Peace Action and for Veterans for Peace, whose advisory board I'm on and who has inspired World Beyond War and many other groups to promote the restoration of Armistice Day tomorrow. Let me say today, happy birthday to the Marine Corps. May it be the last. And let me say, as Jack said, I wrote this book, Leaving World War II Behind, and I cannot begin to give you a rushed summary of even a decent fraction of it here. There's nothing I can offer you here that you can't get better by reading the book, but I will try to limit myself, as Jack suggested, to 20 minutes or so. And those of you who have read the book and have great questions about it, that is something you can get here that you can't get from the book. I'll try to at least give you the table of contents and maybe a few words about each chapter, or at least some of them. The question of why World War II, what about World War II, is not a question I wanted. It's not something I invited. It's when I say let's not have any more birthdays for the Marine Corps, or let's be done with wars, or let's not have any more militaries, it's the question that most people shout out. What about World War II? And if I ask a college class, a high school class, a random group on Zoom, what's a war that was justified? If the answer is any war in the past century and a half, it's almost certainly World War II, right? It's either World War II or distant second and third place, the US Civil War and the US Revolution, right? The war to keep slavery alive and move west and commit genocide, the war that the Canadians must deeply regret they never had one of, or the war to end slavery, even though most of the world ended slavery without similar wars, and we don't think in those terms anymore. If we wanted to end mass incarceration, we wouldn't go pick out big fields and kill millions of young people and then pass a bill to end mass incarceration. We would just jump straight to passing the bill. You know, these distant, almost mythical wars that the stories about are almost fictional. You know, it's those or it's World War II. And when I published this book, I immediately got, angry emails denouncing my obvious dishonesty and nonsense from people who had not yet read the book, of course, because I suggested in the table of contents, in fact, as the heading of chapter 2, World War II was not fought to save anyone from death camps. Well, it wasn't, and no, historian remotely imagines it was in any way whatsoever, but it's a very, very common belief that gets you denounced. It's, in fact, thought of as the good war and has been since the Vietnam War era, right? When this notion that you needed a good war so that you could oppose a bad war without opposing the whole institution of war really made World War II the good war. It wasn't called the good war while it was being fought. Yesterday, I recorded a radio show for my radio show that I'm going to put out to stations next week with a professor from Columbia University named Stephen Wertheim, who has a book out this week called Tomorrow the World, which is about this moment in time in 1940, right after the Nazis had conquered France, when the foreign policy elites, the think tanks, the diplomats, the White House, in the United States, started talking seriously about dominating the globe and coating the earth with US military bases and ruling the world. And of course, most people in the United States, I think more in the United States than outside of it, don't even know that exists, right? Don't even know that since World War II, the United States has been, the owner of most of the foreign military bases on the planet, the top spender on militarism by far, the top weapons dealer to everyone else, et cetera. But those who do know it exists, they either think the United States has been reluctantly dragged into it, kicking and screaming by the world's need to rid itself of Hitler and all the subsequent Hitlers, or they think, as I do, that Thomas Jefferson or Teddy Roosevelt would have conquered the world if they'd only had the airplanes and the factories and the troops, right? But I asked him, Professor Wertheim, whether he ran into any resistance to this idea that the motivation of the United States in World War II was to prevent the Nazis from dominating a large chunk of Europe and Asia and make sure the United States could have free access to trade worldwide and be a global power. And he said, no. You never hear anybody say the war was to save people from death camps. No, never heard of it. So he's a researcher. He's not talking to people. But you'll run into this. So there are all kinds of perspectives on World War II. And I try to address all of them in the book. The idea that the war was to save people from death camps, the idea that the war was to prevent the Nazi aggression in Eastern Europe, the idea, any sort of defense of the war can be addressed. But I think it's important to take on that one about the death camps because it's so popular. And of course, it's completely ahistorical, did not exist in any way whatsoever. There are no posters. Uncle Sam wants you to save the Jews. Public opinion in the United States. I'm going to focus on the United States for lack of time, but we can talk about other Western countries as well. Public opinion was against saving the Jews. There were many, many people who were in favor of it, and there were heroic efforts with some very limited success, but popular opinion before, during, and even in the years after the war, nobody had the excuse of not knowing. The majority was against taking in refugees into the United States. In fact, as Jack knows, in upstate New York, there was the one and only refugee camp for Jews escaping the Nazis in the United States with about 1,000 people, while the United States had about 425,000 Nazi prisoners of war in the United States. So there's your priorities. There were peace activists trying to stop the assault on the Jews and other groups in Nazi Germany, and the British and US governments refusing, making excuses that they couldn't transport that many people, and more privately making the excuse that, well, Hitler will go along with it and that will be an inconvenience and an embarrassment because nobody wants them. There were, of course, public conferences and the decisions made for explicitly anti-Semitic reasons. We won't take them. There were the immigration laws cooked up by the eugenicists. So the Nazi madness for years was we want to expel all the Jews, but no one would take them. Even wanted to send them to Madagascar after conquering France, but then there was the British blockade. There was not a single diplomatic or military step whatsoever taken to save anyone from anything. There were planes that flew over the death camps and prisoners praying for their own demise. But the planes, of course, never targeted the death camps, just nearby targets related to the war. So was World War II accidentally a just war? It's hard to make that argument, at least on this topic, because there were obvious steps that could have saved millions of more people without the war, instead of the war. Chapter 3 is about the fact that World War II did not have to happen, that it came out of World War I and the vicious and stupid way in which the Treaty of Versailles ended World War I, and which led to smart people predicting World War II almost down to the time it started, on the spot at the end of the Treaty of Versailles. It also didn't have to happen for the reasons laid out in a number of these chapters. Chapter 4, the United States did not have to develop and promote the dangerous bunk science of eugenics, which was mainstream, popular, absolutely acceptable in the United States, which developed the theory of the Nordic race and the Aryan race, where doctors practiced eugenicide, where US work was borrowed by the Nazis openly and with gratitude and with great satisfaction and pride by US eugenicists, where the first person was killed with a gas chamber with technology that was later used by the Nazis. So the news reports in recent months of ICE, of the immigration agency in the United States, forcibly sterilizing women, is an endless history. It's not something new. Chapter 5, the United States did not have to develop the practice of racist segregation. You didn't have to have Nazi lawyers coming over hosted by the New York City Bar Association to study how do you create an apartheid state. And to the credit of the protesters, being protested, but being hosted by the lawyers, Chapter 6, the United States did not have to develop practices of genocide, of ethnic cleansing, of concentrating people on reservations. A lot of people don't know the pride that Hitler took in imitating the United States, in talking about Eastern Europe as the US West, and go east, young man, to the wild east, and or duplicating the slaughter of Native Americans with the slaughter of Eastern Europeans. Chapter 7, and I think this is an important one, the United States did not have to fund and arm the Nazis. So I have sections in the book about the work of IBM, Ford, DuPont, General Motors, ITT, US banks, international banks, numerous corporations. In the view of a number of scholars who I quote, the Nazis simply could not have fought World War II without the assistance of US corporations. Albert Speer, Hitler's architect, said that without the synthetic fuels provided by US corporations, Hitler, quote, would never have considered invading Poland, end quote. Chapter 8, the US did not have to prioritize opposing the Soviet Union. Same with Britain. The Western governments did not have to view the Nazis as preferable to the Soviets for all of those years, and immediately tried to pursue a war against the Soviets and create a Cold War against the Soviets upon the conclusion of World War II. This did not have to be the priority. The priority could have been resistance to Nazism and legitimate democratic government in Germany and globally. Chapter 9, the United States did not have to develop the Pledge of Allegiance and the one-arm salute. This is a short chapter and fairly trivial, but we can talk about it if you want to. I don't think it's without some significance. Chapter 10, the United States welcomed Nazis into the US military, right? At least 1,600, some very high-ranking Nazis through Operation Paperclip. So there's a question about how complete this supposed defeat of Nazism was when it was former Nazis who developed the weapons that destroyed Vietnam, right? When it was Nazis who came up with the idea of putting nukes on missiles, who created the ICBM, who designed the underground fortresses in Virginia, West Virginia, Pennsylvania to match the ones in Germany, who developed the anti-Soviet propaganda that drove the Cold War, who developed the chemical and biological weapons programs and VX and Agent Orange and so forth. Chapter 11, the United States did not have to engage in a decades-long arms race with Japan. This is a long chapter. I won't give you much of it here, but there's controversy over details, over who knew what in what moment about the attack on Pearl Harbor. There is no controversy that the United States government planned for, sought out, prepared for a war with Japan, wanted Japan to fire the first shots, that the president had informed the military the war was beginning before the attacks on Pearl Harbor and the Philippines, that the draft had been begun, that the list of Japanese Americans to be incarcerated had begun, that the weapons manufacture had begun, that the foreign bases acquired from the United Kingdom had begun, et cetera, before the shocking attack on the innocent bystander happened at Pearl Harbor. Chapter 12, World War II does not prove that violence is needed for defense, right? And this is the topic of the understanding of the power of nonviolent activism, which has proven so powerful in recent decades, but even back to 100 years ago in defeating coups, in defeating occupations, in defeating tyranny, more with success more likely and success much longer lasting than when violence is used. So there is always an alternative, in fact, usually a stronger alternative to the supposed need to resort to violence for defense. Chapter 13, World War II, aside from being glorious or even defensible, was in fact the very worst thing humanity has ever done to itself in any short space of time. Most environmentally destructive, most murderous, most injurious, most damaging in terms of the long-term trends that grew out of it. Chapter 14, World War II in Western culture is a dangerous set of myths. It really is. And this includes the myths about defending the use of nuclear weapons and many others. And it's probably the top subject of Western entertainment as well as information, nonfiction. World War II is just an obsession, and it shouldn't be. There are many other topics under the sun, and much of what we think we know about it is false. Chapter 15, there was resistance to World War II in the United States. I think it's important for people to recall how great was the resistance, how necessary was the draft as opposed to volunteer militarism, and how right the resistors were in what they did and what they said, and in the side effects, in the fact that some of them really kicked off the civil rights movement in prisons in the United States and took what they learned and what worked and what didn't work out of the prisons after World War II and drove the civil rights movement in the US South. Chapter 16, World War II created taxes. I throw this in here because if you haven't heard, taxes aren't the most popular thing in the United States. And I think that's not just because people know that the billionaires pay at a lower rate than they do. And it's not just because you don't get anything back for your taxes the way you might in Norway or Sweden. It's also because they were supposed to be temporary. They were created. They've been created for each war and then undone, but not undone quite as much. So some taxes remain, but income tax on ordinary people, that's a World War II creation. And it was supposed to end, and it just never has, like the troops in Germany and Japan that Congress is right now fighting to prevent pulling a single troop out of Germany. In many ways, World War II has not ended. Chapter 17, and I thought about making this chapter 1, but chapter 17, the world has changed. Whatever you think about World War II, it is simply bizarre to go back 75 years to find the most recent case that you can justify of what is the single biggest public program of the United States, right? The biggest thing the US government does, 60% of discretionary spending every year into militarism. And 3% of just US military spending could end starvation on Earth. A little over 1% could end the lack of clean drinking water on Earth, et cetera. So if you could find a justifiable war in recent days or months or in your imagination for the coming months or years, it would also have to justify the far greater horror created by the diversion of resources into the institution of war year after year after year. But then to go back 75 years to find something to defend that institution with, to an era without nuclear weapons, to an era of colonialism, to an era of conquest, to an era of international law, or rather the lack thereof, that just bears very little resemblance to the world of today, it is just crazy. So Hitler, I mean, this is the good news. Hitler is not coming to get you. I don't think we've had a war over the past 75 years where Hitler wasn't in it, right? Or Gaddafi wasn't Hitler, Noriega wasn't Hitler, Hussein wasn't Hitler, but they weren't. Even Hitler, to some extent, wasn't the Hitler we're told. The lies that even Franklin Roosevelt pushed to suggest Hitler was coming to the Americas were not real. These were war lies, whether you want to defend them for the greater good, dragging the stupid public into war, they're lies. They're not honest and they're not democratic with a small d. Last and final chapter, chapter 18, World War II and the case for war abolition. This is where I return to my usual argument, the one that I make, the one that World Beyond War makes endlessly, that tends to elicit the initial objection, hey, what about World War II? And that is this critique of the whole institution of war, what it does to the natural environment, what it does to self-governance, what it creates in justifications for government secrecy, what it does in fueling racism and bigotry that in turn fuel war, the financial trade-offs that are really the biggest catastrophe here. So obviously there's a lot more in the book, and my real goal is to write a book that somehow creates a world where people read books. But in the absence of that world, that's my basic summary. So let's go to your questions and concerns.
Yes, thank you, David. We have so many questions and comments coming in on the chat, and we also invite folks to use the raise hand feature. We want to hear from you. So you can use the raise hand feature by clicking participants and then click raise hand, and then we will call on you. If you're on the phone, you can press *9 to raise your hand, and then we will call on you. So I hope some hands start going up, but I will start reading off some of the questions from the chat and comments. David, can you speak more to why World War II was not necessary for defense?
Sure, I can try. And I would note, Greta, that there are people, literally physically raising their hands, whether you can spot them in this many people or not.
I will not be able to see that, so please use the Zoom raise hand feature.
Yeah, presumably they've heard you say that and are attempting it. We'll see. Yeah, I mean, the fact is that nonviolent resistance, even at the time of the supposedly defensible revolution in the United States colonies, is an incredibly powerful tool, despite the fact that it was utterly absent from anthropology, from academia, from studies. It wasn't developed as a field of human endeavor, but it's incredibly powerful, so that you saw women in the streets of Berlin nonviolently protesting Nazism and winning their demands, and then brushing their hands off and saying our work is done, rather than organizing and escalating. You, of course, didn't see any of the supposed opponents of Nazism supporting nonviolent resistance to it prior to the war or even during the war. But you saw incredible successes in resisting what the Nazis wanted in some countries of Eastern Europe, and even in places like Norway and Denmark. But since then, and even before then, you've seen nonviolent activism overturn coups, block coup attempts, end occupations, effectively disempower occupations, overthrow tyrants and dictators. And people who have done studies of this, like Erica Chenoweth and Maria Stefan's study, have found that campaigns that are principally nonviolent are over twice as likely to succeed. That is quite likely to fail, but over twice as likely to succeed. And success does not mean that nobody gets hurt. And success does not mean that your violent opponent, it participates and signs an agreement to have a nonviolent conflict with you. No, they're still violent. But nonviolent activism for peace and justice is more likely to succeed, and those successes are dramatically longer lasting than with violence. It's also, interesting that in the United States, people are able to talk about guns contributing to gun violence, even if we know that there are cultural causes and it's possible to have guns without gun violence. We also know that it's not possible to have gun violence without guns. But when you look at the world of militarism, nobody ever wants to talk about not just the fact that US corporations were building weapons for the Nazis. And when the US troops first encountered the Nazis, they were shocked that the Nazis were all driving US made trucks, right? But you have the US and Russia and others pretending to try to negotiate peace in this war in Azerbaijan and Armenia right now, for example. And there's no talk of even threatening, even hinting at ceasing to provide weapons to both sides of that war. right? So there are alternatives that you can talk about in particular cases. There are also structural alternatives, right? Joe Biden could come in if he had the decency and undo the vicious punishment of the officials of the International Criminal Court put in place by Donald Trump. You could support the rule of law as well as the rule of demilitarization and disarmament and cooperation and effective partnership across the world instead of all the hostility and militarism. And these are things that could have been done to a far greater extent prior to World War II, just as after them.
Thanks, David. Another question from the chat. Many Japanese people believe that FDR knew about the Pearl Harbor bombing beforehand, but allowed it to happen to whip up support for the war. How true is this?
Quite possibly 100%, but I don't think we can say that with 100% certainty. At least it's clear that historians have not reached that consensus. There are arguments made to that effect, but I think it's getting sidetracked into a less than helpful question to focus on the particular details. I mean, we know that Roosevelt told his top officials that the Japanese attack was coming, and he was off by a few days. We know that top officials in the U.S. military wanted the Japanese to attack, sought to provoke the Japanese to attack, and thought the Japanese were soon going to attack. Which transmissions were decoded and known to whom, and kept secret from whom. This is where there's disagreement. But the fact that Japan was very likely to attack, as it did, the Philippines and Hawaii and Guam and Alaska and so forth, is not really up for dispute. And this would not have shocked anyone at the time. Most people saw this coming. I mean, there were marches for a decade or more in the streets of New York City and other cities in the United States against the coming war with Japan. Stop pushing for war with Japan. Reverse the approach with Japan. And these people were, of course, not listened to. So we know for a fact that the US government was not taking basic steps to try to avoid war with Japan. We know that US officials had drafted memos laying out strategies that would provoke war with Japan, and that for whatever reason, most of those steps were taken. So I think focusing on what we know for a fact and what we know should have been done is more than sufficient to debunk the popular understanding.
Okay, let's go to some of the raised hands. I see all of those popping up. Matthew, you can now unmute.
Okay. All right, thanks. David, this is so great. I really appreciate it. Thanks to Greta, as always, and for Jack for organizing this. One of the things that keeps coming to me about World War II was how much of a favorite in the 1930s Hitler was over Stalin, and how the West, in the sense of Western Europe and the United States, was more afraid of communism than fascism. One example, maybe my favorite example, is up until the spring of 1940, up until around March 1940, the primary British war plan was to fight the Soviet Union rather than Nazi Germany, even though the Nazis had already declared war on the Brits. Is this something that you've come across a lot? And could you speak more to this about how so many politicians and newspapers and pundits in the West saw Hitler as a better bet for the U.S. or and for England and France, as opposed, particularly as a hedge, say, against Stalin, as someone that they could control, and that fascism was a better option to support than communism?
Yeah, I wish everyone weren't muted and we could applaud Matthew Ho, who is one of our great whistleblowers in this country, who quit the war on Afghanistan publicly, and I think everyone ought to do that. I think one of our best known long-time whistleblowers, in a way you could say, would be Veterans for Peace hero Smedley Butler, who Matt Ho probably knows why Smedley Butler went from being in charge of Quantico to being incarcerated there, just like Bradley Manning later did, and it was now Chelsea Manning, of course, and it was, of course, because Smedley Butler had recounted a story that a friend had told him of riding in a car with Benito Mussolini, and Benito Mussolini driving over a young girl and making some casual remark about never looking back and driving on down the Italian road. And because the US government prioritized good relations with people like Hitler and Mussolini, Smedley Butler went in the slammer. Until his friend came out publicly and said, yes, I told him that because it was true, right? And what I do in the book, in large part in this chapter, is quote the statements of US and British officials, some of whom, like Harry Truman as a senator on the floor of the Senate, said, let's help the Russians if the Germans are winning, and the Germans if the Russians are winning. That way they kill more of each other. That was quite popular. Numerous people said that, or words to that effect. But others said very clearly, we would prefer the Nazis win to the Soviets. And that was a popular view, and the King of England, who had to abandon his throne because he married a woman from Baltimore who had scandalously previously been married and divorced, there was also another reason why they didn't want that guy around. And it was because of his love for the Nazis. And this was quite popular in the higher levels of British government and ruling royalty, and in Washington, D.C. That there was great admiration, and of course it was with regrets, and yes, he has flaws, but there was all this sort of forgiving talk of bad apples and so forth when the Nazis would commit atrocities, and that became less and less defensible as time went on. But the threat to fascism was worldwide. It was quite popular in the United States, and it's to the great credit of the United States that it was not as popular in the United States as it was in some other countries. It was quite popular in France, and it's to the credit of France that it wasn't more popular, but it wasn't some isolated phenomenon that only existed in 3 countries. This was a worldwide trend, and in fact, perhaps Smedley Butler's most significant act was refusing to cooperate with a proposed coup against Franklin Roosevelt that would have installed a fascist regime in the United States, which was something that certain people in Wall Street kept trying for a number of times in those years.
Okay, moving on to the next question. David, can you talk about whether U.S. corporations were doing business with the Nazis?
The answer is yes. If you want some more information on that, what I lay out in the book, for example, IBM knowingly worked with the Nazis, created the machines that were used to catalog and categorize the people who should be worked to death, who should be killed immediately, who should be sent to which camp, how do we track, all of these victims. Those were IBM machines, and there were IBM technicians who worked on them and adjusted them and updated the machine, did the system updates for the Nazis. General Motors, DuPont, numerous corporations, worked in Nazi Germany, knowing what Nazi Germany was about, sometimes out of pure desire for profit and the goal of working anywhere they could work, but also in some cases out of real support, political preference for the Nazis. And I talk about, the CEOs and executives who were really promoters and funders of the rise of Nazism from the United States, and those who were, really just out to make a buck wherever they could, and about the failure of the US government to really engage in an all-out effort to stop any of this illegal trading with the enemy. And you read the defense. I mean, the most pro General Motors defense of General Motors' conduct with the Nazis is, well, they had a corporate obligation to maximize benefits for their shareholders. It's not they didn't do it, It's not they didn't build trucks and weapons and import necessary materials and technologies and share technologies with the Nazis that they might not even have been sharing with the US government. It's that they had the obligation to do it. They weren't, Nazi ideologues. They just were out to make a buck. For those of us who don't find that defensible, we don't find that defensible.
Thanks, David. Okay, let's turn to another raised hand. David Log, you can now unmute.
Right. Thank you, David. A great seminar here. First of all, I want to say is that one thing about you is that you're not only an intellectual who brings a great deal of facts and background to what you say, but you get in the streets. Because I remember one of my big regrets was not getting arrested with you at the Senate office building a few years back, and I regret it to this day. But I think that what I like most about your book, and it's a real page turner, is that most of us in the anti-war community and Vets for Peace, for example, we always end up getting that question. So, well, what about the good war? What about World War II? And for the most part, I've come up with vague answers, but they never were satisfying to me, nor to the person I was giving them to. But with your book, it's given me like, oh my God, this is just great ammunition, different directions that go from the corporate influence, the anti-communist, and the hypocrisy of the supposed anti-Semitic America. It's a great tool, and knowing you're not just an ivory tower intellectual. You get in the streets, and I think that's as important as what you have to say.
Well, is that your pseudonym, Log? Is that your pen name? You're muted. You're muted. Well, Vets for Peace, at least in Minnesota, I don't know about the rest of the world, but Vets for Peace is a great organization and does great work. Oh, now you're unmuted.
Yeah, I am. No, they cut my name. There's a Logs Done on it for some reason. It's okay.
I don't know why. This World War II as the good war thing. Sometimes I think it would help certain people to understand that it didn't spontaneously grow out of World War II. Like people during and after World War II didn't think anything of the sort. And it was really during the war on Vietnam that it became popular to see in the US media and US conversations, World War II, the good war, right? And we saw a very similar thing when the Iraq war became so unpopular that people started talking about the war on Afghanistan as the good war, right? But if the war on Iraq had never happened, who in the world would have said the war on Afghanistan was a good war? There's anything good about it. They've never identified something good about it. It's just that it's not the war on Iraq, right? And so I think that there's this desire to not be a radical, to not be extreme, to not denounce war as a whole. That would just be loony. So if you're gonna run for president as Barack Obama, you have to say, oh, I'm against the dumb wars, I'm for the smart wars. What the hell is a smart war? I don't know. But this is where, World War II as a good war came out of the war on Vietnam. It's a product of the war on Vietnam. you know, and certainly the myths that are so popular among ordinary people about World War II that has something to do with saving Nazi victims and so forth, you know, those didn't exist during World War II. This stuff is all created after the fact. And we have lies created, you know, as we speak about wars 5, 10, 20 years ago. There are often lies created about wars long after the wars are over. And I think it can help some people in some ways to realize that, you know, we're not revisionisting, you know, ordinary, spontaneous common sense. We're trying to undo myths that were created by a pro-war media and educational system long after the wars.
Very good. And let's get arrested sometime together, okay?
Yeah, I don't even remember what arrest you're talking about, so you probably didn't miss much. I wouldn't lose sleep over that. But
Okay, turning to another question from the chat. David, can you give some talking points of how to respond to the question, what if there's another Hitler? Which is a common question that people get and are kind of unsure of how to respond to that.
Well, you know, when up through World War II, and really up through the year after World War II, you know, and the trials at Nuremberg that were based on the Kellogg-Briand Pact and the notion that the Kellogg-Briand Pact should really be adhered to, conquest was normal. Huge amounts of territory were conquered and changed hands every year. And this was considered legal and normal, or neither legal nor illegal, just like the weather, you know. And when war was banned by the Kellogg-Briand Pact in 1928, some wars were prevented, other wars and conquests happened, but the international community, such as it is, didn't recognize them as acceptable, considered that territory still belongs to those guys. And after World War II, the legal boundaries of the world became what they were in 1928, with few exceptions here and there. Most of the exceptions, most of the conquest, since World War II is, U.S. military bases and Israel in Palestine. It's very small amounts of land. For the most part, nobody takes huge amounts of territory and gets to keep them anymore. And nobody conquers territories as colonies and occupies them as colonists anymore. In fact, when they built the United Nations after World War II, they built the building in New York City. They put in, I think, 70 seats because there were 50 or so countries. We'll make 20 extra in case the world goes nuts, right? And before long, there were 100, 150, 200 countries. And they had to give all the audiences seats to the countries because it was safe to be little. It was safe to be a small country. There was no point in freeing yourself and becoming a small country when some other country was just going to come in and conquer you. But when you had a shot at being independent, right? And so colonialism, with some glaring and horrendous exceptions, virtually ended. Conquest virtually ended. The application of the rule of law and negotiated settlements and even prosecution of war criminals, as long as they're from Africa, became, new ways in which the world interacts. And so the fact is that the big wealthy countries have never gone to war with each other again yet, thank goodness, since World War II. They've just waged proxy wars and sold all the weapons for the little countries to fight each other. But in part because of the altered structure of law, the advancement of the rule of law, in part because of the existence of nuclear weapons, you haven't had the big wealthy countries go to war with each other. Hitler was not about to take over South America or North America. Hitler was not going to be a lasting imperial force. Hitler was not a threat to you in Iowa or Ohio. It just, and who, how would it have even been done? I mean, this notion that North Korea is going to take away your freedoms. I mean, they would have to literally have to clone every North Korean 10 times to send them over to do the occupation. They don't have enough of them, right? It's just madness. And every Hitler we've seen, from Gaddafi to Saddam Hussein to Noriega to they aren't Hitler. They may be horrible people. There are horrible people all over the world, and they seem to be disproportionately in positions of power in governments. But that doesn't make them imperial colonial threats to occupy the United States. But if it did, and if you were a believer in defensive militarism and you wanted to have missiles and airplanes on your borders, fine with me. We would get rid of 80% of the US military that has no defensive purpose whatsoever, just serves to antagonize and create hostility and waste money and destroy the natural environment. And if we scaled it back that way, well, then you would kick off an incredible reverse arms race, and scaling it back the rest of the way would begin to look reasonable to people.
Thanks, David. We have a couple of questions coming in about Poland and whether war was inevitable after the invasion of Poland by Germany.
Well, I don't know if this is too philosophical for you, but I don't see how anything is ever inevitable that people choose to do. Things are more likely. But it's interesting that when Poland was invaded and the United Kingdom declared war, it didn't actually fight a war. There was a period that historians call the phony war, where war has been declared, there are occasional bombings, but there's no Western Front created yet. There's no big war happening yet. And what could have been done? Could negotiations have taken place? Could alternatives have been found? Of course, in that great beloved moment that everyone flies back to in their time machine, yes, but even more so the week before, the month before, the year before, the decade before, even more so. The alternatives are endless. I mean, you didn't have to end World War I by humiliating and punishing one country and extracting all the wealth, not from its wealthy citizens, but from its ordinary people, and splitting up the territory of German-speaking people and excluding Germany from the League of Nations and refusing to talk with Germany about anything. You didn't have to do that, and you didn't have to support the rise of Nazism, and you didn't have to support the armaments of the Nazis, and you didn't have to sit back and watch while the Nazis began to take over countries, including Czechoslovakia. There were alternatives that were never taken. But if you ask me if anything was inevitable, you don't even have to tell me what it was. I'm going to say no. So I don't know if that answers your question.
Okay, let's turn to some of the raised hands. Gary, you can now unmute.
Hi. Just to go a little further with what you've said, I think you pretty well answered the question, but in recent times, our involvement in Afghanistan has, for some people, has apparently raised hopes. Young women going to school and the fear of the Taliban coming in. How would you respond when someone raises the question about once we've been involved in another country, how do we get ourselves out of that in such a way that we don't abandon those whose hopes have been raised by that involvement?
Well, I think it's an important question because it's popular, and I think it's a fair and reasonable question. I object to the use of the word "we" in it on a Zoom call with presumably people from numerous different parts of the world and people like myself who don't identify themselves with the US military in the first person. But to rephrase it, if once the US military is in a war, how should it get out of it? I think the answer that one of the most prominent women's groups in Afghanistan has been giving for well over a decade now has always been basically right, which was when the U.S. and its sidekicks eventually leave, it's going to be hell left behind, but it's going to be worse the longer they take to do it. And there's no question that there are horrors on all sides in Afghanistan. There's no question that there's not an obvious, easy path to peace and peace and democracy in Afghanistan. But this idea that you should take decades to get out of there. And Obama was reckless in pretending to get out of there. Trump was reckless in promising 4 years ago to get out of there. Trump and Biden were both reckless in promising this time around to get out of there. I'm not convinced. And I think there's also a lack of imagination applied to these very popular green pieces of paper called U.S. cash. I mean, you could transform Afghanistan into paradise on earth if you were willing to spend what you're willing to spend on destroying the place. And of course, we're not. Of course, we'll be lucky if we can get anyone to spend a fraction. But I think finding a path to a non-violent, stable society with rights for others in Afghanistan is going to require many steps, and some of which can be carefully assisted in from outside Afghanistan. But getting the military out has to be one of them. And the idea that 20 years is too rushed is just madness. I hesitate though to speak on this question when I'm looking at Matt Ho. I don't know if Matt wants to answer this question for us.
Matt, I think you can unmute. Yeah, there you go.
I think it just goes back to the notion of not getting involved to begin with. That once you're involved, you're going to have all these narratives saying why you can't leave. And then it's also true that being there, you construct a house of cards. Say use an Afghanistan model. When you invade a nation, occupy it, put hundreds of thousands of foreign troops and contractors in there, and then create an economy and a government where 95% of the GDP comes from foreign sources. You've basically made it a client state. Of course you can't leave. So that's one of the things about whether it's conscious or it's not. I think it tends to be an unconscious, but it's very real, is that the United States, when it's in these occupations, creates a necessity for it to remain there. And I don't think there's a cop in the back room of the Pentagon that's smart enough to create this complexity that if we leave, things will get so much worse and everything will fall apart. But it's true that that's what happens because, again, we build a house of cards and it's going to fall. And it just comes back to the idea that, just don't begin these things in the first place because they are never, not even just for not even aspects of morality, rather aspects of like efficiency or practicality. These operations, these occupations and invasions never work. And then, of course, the morality aspect, which is, I think, the biggest one to begin with. But yeah, again, David and Greta and everyone, thank you for this.
Thanks, Matt.
Okay, Mike Goodman, you can now unmute.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, I had two brief questions. One is if Hitler was not planning on, keeping the state that he built, keeping that around forever, then why did he label the Third Reich as the 1,000-year Reich? And then my second question is, wasn't part of the problem that there were quite a few people in the upper class echelons of British society that supported Hitler quite openly, and that was one of the reasons why the politics of appeasement and why Neville Chamberlain was so popular and Winston Churchill was ignored during that period. Thanks.
Well, I what Hitler envisioned and when he envisioned it, you can look at his own writings and statements, and to the extent that they are consistent, I think he was nuts. But certainly he wanted a permanent global power. There's no question that that's what he wanted. That's a different statement from he was a plausible threat to create it. I think in mid 1940 and into 1941, there were people who thought you were going to end up with a Nazi sphere of influence in much of Europe and Asia, and then a U.S. taking control and dominating the rest of the earth, and that was going to be the Cold War until it ended. But that became less and less likely as the Soviets defeated the Nazis, and one of the strange stories you get from learning about World War II via Hollywood is that the United States defeated the Nazis, when of course 80% of the Nazi losses in World War II were to the Soviets, which wouldn't have been that different without the U.S. aid to the Soviets. When Henry Luce wrote in Time magazine at that time that the United States needed to dominate the globe and have an American century for living space, as he translated Hitler's Lebensraum, that too was a vision of a lasting imperial dominance that actually turned out to be more plausible, at least in retrospect. What was the second part of the question?
My question was about the right-wing circles and organizations in Britain that advocated friendship with Germany.
Yeah, there's no question, as I discuss much better than I can or will do here in the book, that Nazism and fascism and their own nativist forms of fascism were quite popular in these other countries, including the United States. I think peace was even more popular. I think resistance to joining in, World War I Part 2 was primarily because war is a horrible, destructive, murderous thing that kills lots of people. And, if World War I was going to be any model, spreads deadly disease, pandemics, and other forms of destruction, and is simply highly undesirable. I think that was more significant in the U.S. resistance to war than U.S. affection for Nazism, which I think was significant, but much, much less so. And I think what you saw in the polling leading up to U.S. entry into World War II was, increasing willingness to say, yes, I would support the U.S. joining the war if it's the only way to stop Nazism. And then of course, once Pearl Harbor, Philippines, etc., happened, the polling changed dramatically, whereas the Nazis didn't. So I think it's a story. It's an unpopular story that's too seldom told, how much support fascism had in the United States, but it wasn't that much. support. It wasn't the principal reason people don't like war. People don't like war because it's war.
Okay, another question from the chat. David, can you talk more about the Nazi collaboration with the US government? For example, Nazi lawyers that came over to the US for consultations?
Well, there's a great book on the question of segregation laws that came out just relatively recently. I'm looking for the name of it in my book. This is the other reason books are better than me talking. This book called Hitler's American Model, the United States and the Making of Nazi Race Law by James Whitman from Yale University. This came out actually 3 years ago. And this is something that Hitler wrote about from before he took power. The model for the world of segregation laws was in the United States. It was in the United States where you had laws that tried to figure out how to give citizenship, but limited citizenship to certain people, how to figure out definitions for who those people were. This stuff was pretty tricky, and the Nazis, did it gradually in stages because they're habituating people to horrors, but also because they're trying to figure out how to do it. And they came over and studied with US lawyers, segregation laws. They studied eugenics theories. I don't want to say science, with US eugenicists. And this was, mutual, open, collegial collaboration with public thanking and gratitude, and US lawyers and eugenicists proud of their influence on Nazi Germany. This is when Whitman wrote this book 3 years ago. He theorized that some of these topics are not popular in Germany because Germans don't want to be seen as blaming anybody else. Germany has gone to a real extreme, which in some ways is quite admirable. They accept their guilt. They teach kids about past wrongs by their government, at least certain types of past wrongs. That has some side effects. They won't talk about certain topics that are perfectly legitimate to talk about. They won't question any atrocities committed by Israel, etc. But these are also topics that people in the United States don't want to talk about.
Okay, we have about 25 minutes left, and we still have quite a few raised hands, so we will try to get to everyone. Jean Cushman, you can now unmute.
Hi. I want to know, I'm an ally of a senior ally of the Sunrise Movement here in Maryland. And I would think they would be a natural ally of the peace movement. But the Green New Deal and the Sunrise Movement takes no position on war. And I find that to be very frustrating. And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about that.
I don't have any different thoughts from the ones I've had for decades, but I 100% agree with you, or more if that's possible. If you look at WorldBeyondWar.org/environment, you'll see what we think and recommend. If you look at WorldBeyondWar.org/No War 2017, you'll see all the videos and speeches from our conference on this topic in 2017 in DC, where we tried to bring together those environmentalists who were willing and those from peace activism to join our efforts. And we did our kayak flotilla in front of the Pentagon with the banners, "No more wars for oil, no more oil for wars." It's, going back to before World War II, it's very clear which came first, right? The British obsession with the oil was to fuel the Navy. The wars came first. I think, it's very, very difficult in the United States for cultural reasons to get anyone to oppose war. And it's particularly difficult to get big, well-funded organizations that are getting money from labor unions that make weapons or from foundations that fund war, think tanks, etc., or that are, and it's, but we've done a lot of articles about this, a lot of webinars recently about this. Greta and I, or maybe it's Rachel and Greta and I and others are working on a webinar with Canadians coming up in the coming weeks, because in Canada you can get the top environmentalists to join with peace activists on a webinar and talk about the interlocking nature of the two efforts. There is no question in my mind that militarism is a top enemy of the environment. I've never seen a serious argument against that. I've just seen, there are other major enemies of the environment, but that militarism is a significant one. I've never seen that effectively disputed, just as I think militarism is a top enemy of civil liberties or anti-racism or anti-poverty or open government or anything good in the world. I think militarism is like a perfect key that brings all of these intersectional interests together, except that so many of them aren't interested in it. But then there are groups like Extinction Rebellion and many other environmental groups that are open to opposing militarism, just as there are some anti-racist groups like Black Lives Matter or the new People's what is it called? People's Campaign.
People's Campaign.
What?
Poor People's Campaign.
Or the new Poor People's Campaign, etc. So there are organizations of various sizes and strength that are willing to join with anti-war efforts and peace efforts, and they should be supported and encouraged and built up. You can also very often find that your local chapter of the Sierra Club is right there with you on everything, even though the overarching corporate headquarters won't touch you with a 1,000-foot pole. So do reach out to local chapters of all the environmental groups, even if their big national, international names won't go near peace.
Right. Thank you.
Thanks. Okay, Paul Welch, you can now unmute. There you go, Paul. Oh.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you to David on Palestine. It's unknown in the West, in the general population, that we refused the Jews and pushed them on the Arabs. I mean, it's horrible. And as much as you can share about that is helpful and everyone. But the question I have is, your analysis of nonviolence works before the bombs start dropping. And we have to understand we have the possibilities before the bombs. Once the bombs start dropping, after Pearl Harbor, after Hitler invades Poland, Belgium, and starts rolling and went through. I mean, it's nonviolent people, you're not going to make it. They'll roll you over with tanks. So if we could acknowledge that before the bombs start dropping is the time for nonviolence, which we have now. Once the bombs start falling, I'm not sure you can't. You'll have to convince me on that one.
Well, I'll try. I don't know that I can take the full 15 minutes or whatever we have left, but I'll take a little bit of it. You're absolutely right that, again, I don't know where these ideas of we come from, but that certain government powers imposed, foreign people on the people of Palestine and ended up driving out many of the people of Palestine. But as I recount in the book, even there was also the horror of not letting Jews get to Palestine during World War II, who were trying to get there, some of whom ended up at the bottom of the Mediterranean. I think it's also important how key Israel and its militarism and its crimes are in US militarism and crimes, and these sanctions that Trump has put on the chief prosecutor of the International Criminal Court have as much to do with the possibility of investigating Israel as they do with investigating the crimes of the war on Afghanistan. I'm not convinced that tanks don't roll over violent people. I've seen tanks roll over violent people many, many times. I'm not convinced that violence benefits Palestine, or that, rocks and third-rate missiles are effective against the Israeli military. I'm not convinced they're more effective than nonviolence. Again, apart from particular examples, the academic studies are very clear on the trends. The nonviolent campaigns are more likely to succeed than the violent ones. These are not all nonviolent campaigns that begin before there's some problem. They are often nonviolent campaigns that begin in the middle of violent occupations and violent oppression. And yet they succeed more often than does violence. If violence is the answer, once violence begins, we're done for, because there's violence in numerous spots right now. And some of those spots are close to or are involving countries with nuclear weapons. We're done for unless we break out of the thinking that violence is somehow going to be the answer because somebody else started it. I know it's not pleasant that somebody else got to start it. I know it makes us feel bad. I know we want to use violence against that violence that was started against us. But that doesn't mean it's wise or it increases the likelihood of human survival.
David, that's not the question I asked. You didn't answer it. World War II, after we're bombed, I'll grant you, your research, your insights make all sorts of sense before the Pearl Harbor, and made sense before Germany rolling through Dunkirk and England being clearly in the sights of the Nazis, clearly. At that point, give me the nonviolent, not before, give me then the nonviolent approach.
Well, again, I object to always flying the time machine to the most violent moment, but accepting
That's
it,
what
I think
this
you
is
have to let
billed
me
as,
finish the
David.
sentence.
This
What?
is billed as World War II. You're giving us a defense of World War II. We have to acknowledge.
Yeah, you have to let me
Okay.
finish the sentence. I apologize for using the first half of a sentence that was guaranteed to elicit that from you, but let me give what was going to be the second half. So accepting that everyone flies the time machine to that moment, there is nonetheless all kinds of alternatives. Hitler was still at that moment eager to expel from German and conquered territories all of the people he hated and blamed and scapegoated. So rescuing those people, all that was needed was saying, yes, okay, we'll do it. That's all. And if you could evacuate all those people from Dunkirk, you could evacuate all those future victims from Nazi territories. That wasn't going to end Nazi plans for aggression against England or against Eastern Europe. But who started the bombing of civilians is very unclear, right? I mean, it seems that Britain began bombing civilians before Germany did. Who escalated this into total war, and was that necessary? because Germany had England in its sights? That's not clear. Is negotiation ever impossible? I don't see why. I mean, even some of the strongest defenders of World War II, who begin their books exactly as you began this question, denounce, the vast majority of how the war was conducted. And yet, if you could have negotiated a settlement earlier, if, as many people agree, you didn't have to flatten German cities, why couldn't you have tried earlier? And what could possibly be gained now, regardless of what you think of England in the 1940s? What could possibly be gained now from taking that as a lesson for anyone in the age of nuclear weapons?
Okay, I'm going to let some other folks chime in. Al Mitty, you can now unmute.
Hi, David. I've read your book. Thank you for writing it. Thank you for all that you do. You begin chapter 3 with a quote from Winston Churchill, and FDR asked him, or somebody asked him, what would you call the war? And Churchill says, the unnecessary war. And yet now today, Churchill is viewed as the hero. Churchill is the cigar, smoking, chopping, drinking, man who stood up to Hitler, and Chamberlain's viewed as the appeaser. That pervades politics, not only in the US, but throughout the world now, where we have to be tough. We have to stand up to people. We can't negotiate. And I guess, and we see it in Trump, we see it in Democrats, we see it in Albright, we see it in Netanyahu, we see it all over. Can you speak to, is there a way to go back and let's make the so-called appeasers, appeasement is still better than killing. And is there a way to make Churchill less of a hero and others who wanted nonviolence to make them more of the heroes?
I will do my best with what time I've got, Al. Thank you for the question. Paul, I know you wanted to continue. You can email me. You can tell everybody what I got wrong in the chat, and I'll get there if I have time. But Al, I think it's really bizarre, and it speaks to the power of the World War II story that Churchill is not denounced to a greater extent when there are actually, movements to literally rip down statues of past racists and so forth. I mean, there was never a more racist or anti-Semitic or more pro-genocide or more pro-chemical weapons individual than Churchill. Churchill, throw anything at him, he wanted war. He wanted war for decades. So it's putting Churchill in a moment where people think the right thing was to want war that suddenly makes Churchill acceptable. The fact that within hours of the Nazis surrendering, Churchill wanted a war on the Soviets using Nazi troops is, less talked about because it's the war on the Nazis that makes war acceptable. The fact that Patton and other US generals were right there with Churchill wanting immediate war on the Soviets is also not so popular to talk about. Churchill, of course, then wanted the Cold War with the Soviets and the Iron Curtain and the free world and the non-free world and the weapons galore. And he was very much tied with the weapons business and pro-escalation and pro-military buildup for years and years and years. I mean, this is someone who was in charge of the British naval ships when they chose not to protect the Lusitania, which served as such great propaganda for World War I. Right? This is a guy with a horrible history, and the worst of it is in countries of the Southern Hemisphere. between the wars. But I think that maybe the worst notions that come out of World War II are appeasement and isolation. Appeasement is the idea that you're not willing to go to war fast enough. That if you wait, if you delay, if you hold out some chance for peace, if you try some negotiation, you're somehow making the war worse by not starting it soon enough. And you could come up with some argument for this being the case in some war, but it's always used. It's used when, if the inspectors in Iraq could have a few more days, they could say more definitively there are no weapons, and you don't want them to say that. So hurry up, start the war, or you're an appeaser, right? It's used in Libya, where you're pretending that the president of Libya has threatened massacres of civilians, which, horrible individual though he was, he hadn't. Hurry up and bomb Libya, or you're an appeaser. So it's a real argument against any effort to avoid a war. And if you look back, especially through the past 75 years of Western wars, of US wars abroad, this notion that, you'd have to really work at peace or you're going to get war. No, every single case you can look and examine how you really had to work to avoid peace. And part of that is the propaganda of appeasement. The other, of course, is isolationist. There's this notion, and this is something that Stephen Wertheim discusses in his book that I just talked about at the beginning of this, but this ahistorical notion in US textbooks, in US schools, that back in the age of World War I, there were isolationists who didn't want to engage with the rest of the world in any way, which there weren't. The word didn't even, come up until the 30s and 40s. And basically, it's a label for anyone who doesn't want wars and militarism. If you want treaties with the rest of the world, courts with the rest of the world, League of Nations, United Nations, climate agreements, trade, you want to deal with the rest of the world in any way other than militarism, if you don't think NATO is, the greatest thing since apple pie, you're an isolationist, right? Because how else could you communicate with England and France except through NATO? It's unimaginable, right? So either you're a militarist or you're an isolationist. And these concepts, these propaganda tools are some of the lasting damage of this war.
Okay, we will do one more question, and if you didn't have a chance to have your question answered, please do follow up with us over email, and we're happy to engage on all of these topics. You can email us at info@WorldBeyondWar.org, and we will send the recording afterwards as well. Last question, Quentin, you can now unmute.
Hi, everyone. So happy to be here. I have one question. I'm not sure if it can even be answered, but I just wanted to pose the question. So many people I went to school with in high school believe that saving US soldiers' lives with the nuclear bombing of Japan was justifiable, even though so many innocent lives were taken. And I mean, to me, it just seems like a very simple morality problem, but to many people, they don't see it that way. And so how can you change people's minds when there's this collective lack of empathy?
Well, caring about US soldiers' lives, whether it involves the actual act of empathy where you imagine yourself the US soldiers or not, I think is a moral position. It's just a limited and misinformed moral position, because the dropping of nuclear bombs on Japan did not save anybody's lives, and of course cost many people their lives, given the little known fact that Japanese also have lives. And what I do in the book, in the section on mythology, in the chapter toward the end of the book, is to look at what happened and what was argued, where you had most of the top U.S. admirals and generals, almost every top general and admiral in World War II, arguing, some of them beforehand, all of them afterwards, that the bombings, the nuclear bombings, were unjustifiable. And with numerous US government officials arguing, and of course numerous scientists who were involved in creating the nuclear bomb and so forth, arguing to the White House beforehand that it was absolutely unjustifiable. Proposals to make it public, proposals to demonstrate it on an uninhabited territory, proposals to threaten it instead of using it, and of course the documented understanding by Truman and the US government that the war was over, and the willingness of Japan to surrender with the one condition that it gets to keep its emperor, which of course it got to keep only after the bombing. The second bombing, little talked about because it's so difficult to justify a second bombing, even if you pretend you can justify a first one, was actually speeded up to make sure to get it in before the Soviet invasion, because everybody knew that when the Soviets invaded Japanese territory, the war was going to end. And the war did end when, after the bombings and after more fighting and more bombings and even apparently the use of chemical and biological weapons by the United States and the Soviet invasion, it did end. But the study that was done by the group set up by the US government afterwards to study what would have happened concluded that there was no question Japan was going to surrender, even without the Soviet invasion, even without the nuclear bombs, without anything. The war was over. And in fact, the war essentially was dragged out longer in order to use the nuclear bombs, in order to show them to the Soviet Union, in order to demonstrate them to the world, in order to be in charge of the world post bombings. And one thing that I do in the book is summarize an account in a book that came out just this year by Greg Mitchell that looked at the production, very much US military controlled and influenced production of a Hollywood film that came out shortly after World War II, creating a whole bunch of myths about the nuclear bombing that have remained with us. The notion they actually have the US bomber being attacked by Japanese planes, and a US member of the US military dying in his heroic efforts to get the nuclear bomb onto the plane, and the completely false statement that the Nazis are about to help the Japanese get the nukes and so forth. These myths, these are not controversial among historians. I mean, these are false, right? I mean, among historians, there is little question here, as there is on some things like who knew when Pearl Harbor was happening. Yet you have complete falsehoods in textbooks in US schools and being told to my children by US teachers in US schools. I'm not sure how you change that other than, giving people piles of books and asking them to read them.
Okay, thank you so much, David. Thank you everyone for joining us today. That is the end of this program. David or Jack, any last thoughts?
No, thank you all for the terrific questions. Sorry for any we didn't get to. Sorry for at least one we didn't answer satisfactorily, but email or otherwise track us down.
Thanks. This is Jack. Thanks to my grandson, Quentin, for coming in from Spain at the very end. Thank you, Quentin.
All right, thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody.